Today, we'll hear from one of the authors of The Climate Change Garden, down-to-earth advice for growing a resilient garden. Sally Morgan is a botanist with a lifelong interest in gardening. She's written articles and books and teaches courses on food, farming, and the environment. Please welcome Sally. Sally, I'll let you take it from here.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining in tonight. And it's a huge mix. It's lovely to see you from all parts of the state. So brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm just going to, if that's okay, Emma, I'm going to show a couple of slides just to set the scene about Kim and myself, and then we'll open up for questions. So I'm going to share my screen just to set the scene, because obviously Kim and I come from the UK. I'm in a 9B zone and Kim is in a similar zone but much higher altitude, so she gets quite extreme weather. And I'm just going to give you a quick glimpse of our, hopefully you can see that, that's perfect. So this is my walled garden. I live in Somerset, which is in southwest England, between Dorset and Devon, if you know the area. We're inland, zone 9B, and I'm very lucky. I have an organic farm, so I hate to say it, we'll be very biased tonight, lots of organic information. And within the farm, which dates back many hundreds of years, I have a very old walled garden. The farm is actually an old rectory, and the walled garden was used by the staff of the rector to produce vegetables, and it's been restored in recent years. And within it, I've got a small orchard, the vegetable potager you can see here, and also an ornamental area. And we're surrounded by trees and have this beautiful wall over two sides of it, which gives us much protection against the weather. So you may be familiar that if you have a wall, you gain a few degrees of living a bit further south than you actually are because of the presence of the wall. So within this, I can be reasonably self-sufficient, which we'll come to later, I'm sure. And that's another view. I'll just mention one thing here. You can see the dipping pond in the image, and when I come to thinking about water harvesting systems, just remember that. The dipping pond is about 1 meter deep, and it just catches a lot of water that I can use in this garden, and you're seeing it in the height of summer. And Kim's garden is quite different. She's based in West Wales, so quite high up. So although she has the mild coastal zone, she also gets the wind and the cold temperatures. And she's got a demonstration garden there where she does a lot of teaching. And here you can see her polytunnel, or your hoop house, with raised beds. This is her vegetable area surrounded by trees. And as Kim's not here tonight, here is Kim in her garden in the height of summer, with her produce. So she's very much into growing as much produce as possible organically. She is editor of Garden Organics Organic Way magazine. So again, we sing the same song. We're all about organic. So those are just a few photographs to set the scene. And I'm just going to stop sharing there and go back.
All right. Sally, I'd first like to ask how you and Kim became connected. You're both gardeners and writers and gardening teachers, but how did you connect, and how did it come about that you co-authored this book?
Okay, so we haven't actually known each other a huge length of time. We're in very similar organic circles, and we were talking at the same event, and we got nattering, and Kim has been into climate savvy gardening for a while, and I've been writing about climate change for children's non-fiction books for a long time, and we felt that it was important that we started writing about this subject, because back in 2018 nobody was really thinking about the future. Very different to what is happening now. And so actually we got together and we self-published the first edition of the book because nobody was really interested. But we felt it was too important a subject to not write. And having done that, we have now picked up Quarter, who are publishing it for us. So we were a little bit ahead of the times, perhaps, but now we're definitely at the leading edge, I think, and we've been trialing things and working through things longer than a lot of people have been thinking about it, I suspect. So that's our sort of backstory of how we got together.
All right. What effects of climate change were you seeing in your own gardens?
Quite a few. As a botanist, I sort of look at things quite analytically, and I was noticing that we're getting early flowering in the garden, unseasonal flowering, and the autumns were getting longer. And Kim was seeing similar patterns in Wales, but we'd also, like the rest of the world, we'd seen quite a lot of extreme weather. We had had a drought in 2018, which was the trigger for this book. It was the first drought since 1976, so it really took the country by surprise. We'd seen lots of flooding, wettest winters ever, coldest Mays ever, those types of things, which I know is a story repeated around the world. But it was those types of things that we're seeing in our garden. And Kim has been flooded, and she has had to cope with waking up one morning with inches of water in her garden, thanks to the her neighbour, who's a farmer, who changed his practices, and she's seen drought. And the poll mentioned water. Kim is on a private water supply because she's quite remote. And her well dries up, which I'm sure a lot of people in the States would probably associate with. If you're in a remote area, you've got your own water. But thanks to people in the area, like farmers perhaps drawing too much, the water just ran out. So 2018 was a big wake-up call for her, that there was no water coming out the taps. And the same has happened this year. Again, we've had another drought. And that really honed her skills at managing to grow with very little water, because she knew that everything she used in the garden meant she had to bring it in by tanker and things. So yeah, we both had wake-up calls in our gardens, which was behind the book.
You write in the book that the lack of global leadership on environmental matters continues to frustrate and cause a sense of powerlessness among individuals. What sort of power do you see that comes from growing a garden and growing some or all of one's own food?
Yeah, I'm sure, again, many of the viewers tonight would have been frustrated that governments are just not acting on climate. We have the climate conferences every year. We had COP in Glasgow a year ago, and lots of words, no action. But for gardeners, I think it's really important. We have such a big role to play. In the UK, gardeners have larger area than all our national nature reserves. So we have a role. And I've long believed that we need to be self-sufficient. I've grown up with grandparents who always grew their own food, and I've always grown vegetables, and I've always been relatively resilient, relatively self-sufficient in vegetables. And Kim's the same, and I have chickens and I keep pigs, so I can tick the buttons for meat and eggs and veg and fruit. But now I read some amazing books that you can actually produce quite a lot of food on your own balcony, so you don't have to have a garden. I'm exceptionally lucky, I've got a large space. But a fellow Chelsea Green author of mine, Mark Ridsell-Smith, has written about vertical vegetable growing on balconies, and he can produce 70 kilos of food on his balcony, so it is really empowering for people to be able to produce their own food, to be more self-reliant and not to use the supermarkets. And those community operations and food producers are going to be increasingly important, as more and more countries don't want to export their food because they need it for their own populations. We can't expect parts of Africa and parts of Europe to send us their food as they suffer from climate change. So we are all going to have to be more self-sufficient in the food that we produce. So yeah, exciting times, but difficult times.
Sure, certainly. Could you share with us some of the predicted changes in climate and weather patterns that are expected in the US?
Yes, now I'm going to share a screen again because
Please
it's
do.
better to have a look. There was a brilliant report, and if you haven't read it yet, do have a browse. The Climate Central report, which is available online. And I was digging around because I'm actually over in Seattle next week at the Northwest Flower Festival. And I was digging around for some local statistics. So it is quite significant because although it's only looking like small numbers, they all add up. So already in the United States, if we compare it to the 1970s, it's 2.6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the 70s. And there are some areas of the continent which are warming up more quickly than others. So Reno will be a one every so often. It's not the trend, and the trend is warming up. So that's just a little bit of a nutshell. Every area will be slightly different, particularly around the lakes, where you're going to get slightly milder effects, and continental, the coastal areas. But then on the coastal areas, you also have the threat of increasing sea levels, which will affect particularly the northeast because of the melt from the Arctic. So it's a huge topic to cover in a couple of minutes, but that will give you an idea of what's happening. So I need to come out of that and stop sharing. So,
All right.
there you go.
I'm having a power outage over here. We have quite strong winds today. So it could be that Brooke may have to take over if I lose connection again. All right, and before we move into gardening specifics, could you share with us some insights or thoughts you have around the costs of creating resilient gardens?
I mean, it doesn't have to be expensive, fortunately. A lot of making your garden more resilient is to do with the style of practice rather than purchase. And so for me, the obvious place is everything that's produced in my garden stays in my garden or it's eaten. So this closed loop idea that everything you plant grows, and the prunings and the waste and the weeds is all recycled via your composts, so that it is composted and goes back on the soil to add that organic matter. Making your own potting mixes. If you think back 60 years, gardeners didn't go to garden centres and buy plastic bags filled with a grow medium that they could sow their seeds in. They made their own, and it's very easy for people to make their own using their own compost and a bit of loam and some sand and some leaf mold. And so we should be thinking more about how we can produce more of our own materials within our own gardening. And obviously we've got seed saving and propagation, so we don't have to buy so much media. The other thing I was just going to stress at the moment, we're going to get, I think Emma's frozen out, so Brooke, I think, will probably take over. So I'll just make one final point in this area about resilient gardens. When it comes to landscaping, and I'll touch on that, probably in some of the questions later, it can be quite expensive if you adapt your landscaping. But there are elements that you can do quite cheaply. And one of the most exciting areas at the moment that I'm doing a lot of research and about to try myself is recycled building aggregate, to take concrete and to crush it and mix it with crushed bricks and other materials from building sites and use that to grow in rather than using soil, which is a really quite exciting area of development, and that will help us develop more resilient garden. So lots of ideas for people to pick up on there.
That's wonderful. I do apologize for having extreme winds here today, and I can't seem to keep an internet connection, so I've switched to phone. All right. Could you explain the ideas of how gardens can work with nature instead of trying to control it?
Yes, it's interesting. I think gardening styles are changing. I mean, I grew up in an era of immaculate gardens. The lawn was, cut with an inch of its life. The beds were pruned, the trees were pruned, and hedges were tidy. There weren't any weeds around, and it looked, quite immaculate. And that was the style of gardening that was expected. And of course, if you had pests, you can spray it with something, and you're going to apply fertilizers and weed killers to your lawn, so you only had this perfect grass lawn, and then you'd water it for hours on end, so it looked brilliant even in the height of summer. And I think we're moving away, thank goodness, from that, because as we alluded to earlier, our gardens cover such a large area. And if we can improve the biodiversity of our own grow spaces, then we are all doing something to help the biodiversity crisis, which is probably almost as bad as the climate crisis. And so it is that going organic, avoiding those awful chemicals that fertilizers, you don't need fertilizers, you don't need any of the pesticides. If you get a really good balance in your garden with food chains established and lots of natural predators and birds and amphibians and the like, then you are establishing a very resilient growing space, which, you can avoid everything. And then I'm just going to sort of say one thing also. There's a big movement over here about weeds, that actually weeds are really important. And it's interesting because I've got this sort of thing, I'm a little bit nerdy about floral diversity in my growing space. I want as many months as possible to have as many different types of flowers open at the time, so that if early insects came out now, say in February or in October, there were some flowers for them to find. And also there was a range of different types of flowers, so I could support a greater range of insects. And so every month I go around my garden and I just count the number of different flowers that are open. And I'm looking for tubular and open ones, different coloured flowers on my shrubs, trees, and in my garden, in the herbaceous borders. But interesting, particularly at this time of year and at the end of the season, about 50% of the flowers that are open at this time of year, including yesterday, were weeds. And so those weeds have such an important role to play in my floral diversity. So I have to have them, and I just sort of have them all over the place until they get really out of hand, and then they may get removed. So I would urge everybody, if you're looking for a climate resilient garden, just be a little bit more relaxed about the weeds, because they have such an important role to play for your pollinators and your predators. So a little bit more relaxed, a little bit of rewilding would be brilliant.
All right. The book addresses challenges like flooding, heat, drought, pests, and more. What design ideas and advice do you have to meet these challenges?
There's all sorts. I mean, obviously the book is full of them, and I'm just going to touch on a few ideas that are easy for me to explain in a few minutes, because otherwise you'd get me here all night and you want to go to bed. So I'm going to start with flooding, partly because there's just one word I like to say about flooding, and that is permeable. We need more of our growing spaces to have permeable surfaces, so that the water has got somewhere to sink when it comes down in heavy rainfall. And it's these heavy bursts of rain that we are going to get more. Probably our total rainfall won't change, but the pattern of the rainfall is, as I mentioned with those statistics, 6 cities in the States last year had more than 6 inches of rain, 24 hours. And so if all of us have permeable surfaces, we're thinking of gravel, a crushed aggregate, we're thinking less concrete, less tarmac, and so that the water can get into the ground rather than flowing down the street and into the storm drains and just overpowering everything. So we need a little bit of time when those extreme weather events happen, that the system needs as many minutes as possible for the water to sink before it starts flooding. And there's some silly other things you can do when you know a big storm's coming. And it's getting quite important over here. We've all got rain barrels, but in winter, you don't need your rain barrels to be full because you're not using the water. So what they're advising in many areas now that are prone to flooding is when you know a big storm's coming and you're going to get plenty of rain, get out there, open them up, let your current water drain away. So when the rain hits you, you've got 200-300 litres of water that you can catch before it starts overpowering the drain system. And just imagine that if every community and every household were all doing the same thing, emptying their water, their rain barrels before it started raining, we could hold that first deluge and reduce the amount of flooding. But there's all sorts of things around this, you know, so with the permeable surfaces, the water can sink into the ground. And the other thing which we're seeing increasingly, and I must say the States is ahead of us than in Europe, are things called rain gardens, where you catch a little bit of the water that comes down and hold it there until it soaks away gradually. And these are just very neat little shallow depressions, as if you're digging a shallow pond, but then you fill it up again with loose material and plant it. So it just soaks the water up. And you notice these increasingly in streets. You'll see little shallow depressions where the water can collect rather than drain into the road. And I'm told Seattle's got loads, so I'm really looking forward to seeing those next week. So that's flooding. If we flip the coin and we think about too hot, heat waves, and too little water, I think the key thing here is water harvesting. The cost of water, I know, is in California is extortionate, and I suspect it's not going to get any better elsewhere as we run out of this such important resource. So we do need to harvest as much as we can in order to reduce our dependency on water coming out the taps. And so I pointed out my dipping pond earlier in the photograph. I catch a lot of water in that dipping pond. It's attached to a very large roof. So the roof drains into that pond, and there's 3,000 litres. It's a nice little feature. I get wildlife coming to it. It's got a little ramp so that if hedgehogs and other animals fall in, they can get out. I get a lot of insects in summer, but it also provides me with all the water I need for the garden. And it's a dipping pond because it's Victorian, and you can put your bucket in or your watering can in one go, and you can fill it up in 3 seconds, which is brilliant. I can water the garden really quickly because I'm a very impatient gardener. I don't like standing by or water tap, just letting my can fill up. So it's quick, it's easy, it holds a lot of water, but there's all sorts of things you could adapt to create something similar. And also when we are thinking of temperatures, high temperatures, it's mulching, covering your soil and keeping that rain, the moisture in the soil for as long as possible. And then, of course, it's in high temperatures, it's planning your garden so that you shade your house. And so you shade your plants as well. So shade will become more important. And we've only got to think about trees in cities to know how important that is for walking down the road and having the shade of a tree. And then, of course, the right plant in the right place, the drought-tolerant plants that you might be working towards in the future. But the trouble is we're in these very changeable era at the moment. We haven't got that warmer climate yet. This winter all around the world has showed us that we can flip the other way so quickly. So we don't want to move too far down that path of drought-tolerant planting because we might get very mild, wet winters, which those plants don't like. So it is tricky. And then the other just point I'll make is pests, about designing our gardens. We are going to be threatened, I suspect, with more pests, the beetles particularly. I know I'm wearing a beetle, but I do like nice beetles. But there are a lot of beetles which are going to challenge our gardens in the years to come. We have the problem with longhorn beetles in Europe taking out our city trees. And one of the reasons they're doing that is because we don't have a very good diversity of trees in our cities. We tend to stick to a few species because they grow well. But when a pest comes along and kills them all off, we're not going to have any amazing trees in our cities anymore. And I'm thinking of Berlin and the linden trees, the lime trees. And the same applies to many North American cities where you depend too much on a few species of trees. So when you get something like the Japanese beetle coming across, and I know that's causing devastation for rose gardens and other plants, you've got the potential of Colorado beetles spreading, the Mexican bean beetle. We are going to see more pests, and these mild winters that I mentioned will allow them to overwinter and to start earlier in the year and to fit more generations in. So it's going to be very tricky. So we need to be sort of experimental and nifty and try out lots of different things.
Accept that mistakes, lessons learned. Tell us about making sure.
Sorry, Emma, your sound is breaking up a little bit.
Oh,
You're going in and out.
I'll take it from here.
Thanks, Brooke.
Tell us about making sure there are habitats for beneficial creatures like frog, wasp, and other pollinators.
Okay, so I think that comes back to, for me, a mosaic of habitats. And if you sort of cast your mind back to my original photograph in Kim's gardens, we like to have lots of different types of plants and lots of different types of places for them to grow in. So in my garden, I've got my vegetable area, but I've also got the wall, I've got an orchard, I've got shrubs, a hedgerow, I've got water. I've got paths of different substrates. So I've got bark paths, gravel paths, lots of different types of habitat. And this creates a mosaic of habitats. And that leads to more diversity, because the more diverse your garden or your growing space, however small, the more diverse animals you're going to bring into that space. And key to many habitats also is dead wood. And not being too tidy as a gardener. So this time of year, obviously in our temperate gardens here, all of our perennial herbaceous plants are dormant, but I've left all of the dead matter above the ground. So I've got lots of flower stalks, old flowers, seed heads and the like. I've got a lot of dead wood in the garden, and these all create habitats for small animals to creep inside. And in fact, I was cutting down a couple of shrubs the other day, and I noticed they had hollow, which is perfect, little hollow stems, which I could group together to create little mini habitat for beasts and mini beasts. So those types of dead wood, standing dead wood, not being too tidy. Over here, we have a phenomenal entomologist called Dave Goulson, who writes about bees and other insects and making a case for how we can conserve them. And he's saying that we don't have enough dead wood in our gardens, and we cut down and we tidy things up. But actually, one of the most important habitats is an old tree, a dead tree, just hanging in there until it rots down and falls down. And you can actually drill holes in those dead trees to create even more cavities. So it's being inventive with those types of structures and creating these piles of wood, piles of stone, because your good beetles will hide underneath them, and amphibians over winter will hide in those too. So it's, for me, to create more habitat is about having lots and lots of different types of habitat. And I come back to my diversity again. I've got perennials and annuals, I've got bulbs, trees, shrubs. I've got lots of different plants in different stages of their life cycle. So the more varied your garden space, the more wildlife you'll have in it.
Great, thank you. And one more question. What are some suggestions for climate change garden vegetables?
That's tricky, because I know you probably don't have the same as we do. There's one obvious one, but I don't think you grow lots, but we've been discovering over here, we grow a lot of beans, and I know you all do too. And you've got pole beans and runner beans, and runner beans tend to be used as more ornamental, I think, rather than as for its pods. Over here, we're fanatics about runner beans. We've got hundreds of varieties, many heritage ones. they like cool, damp summers, and last year was really bad for them. And so they're not thriving in the drier, warmer summers, whereas the pole beans, which we call French climbing beans, did very well. So they sort of, you do need to find the one. But I think regardless as to where you live, you need to look at the varieties that you grow, to read about them, to choose the ones perhaps which are more drought resilient. But also, again, I come back to this word diversity, to grow a range of varieties. So if you have the space, it's nice to grow lots of different varieties to hedge your bets. So in my brassicas, for example, this year I've got white Russian kale, red Russian kale, black kale, a purple sprouting brassica, broccoli, as well as my Brussels sprouts, and they're all in one bed. So although I've got one crop in one bed, I've got 6 or 7 different varieties of that crop. And I grow 6 or 7 different types of beets as well, all mixed up in rows together. And if one fails, perhaps the other one won't. So definitely hedging my bets in terms of which varieties. And then when it comes to seed saving, I know we talk about local is best and we should save seed and use in our own spaces, but I think we should also swap seed saving, to swap our seeds, because increasingly as our garden, as the area in which we garden changes, what suits my garden today may not suit it in 10, 15 years time. So for example, with my parsnips, I have always saved my own parsnips. They have a very short seed life. And I have what we call a land race, because I choose every year and I grow in the same area. I'm developing my own strain, my own variety. But I'm worried that it suits my garden today. Will it suit my garden in 10 years' time? And so I've taken on board ideas from the organic movement in the UK called populations. And I'm mixing up the parsnips now. So rather than just saving my own, I'm mixing with somebody else's and I'm swapping my seed. And I'm also growing a mix of varieties and allowing them all to cross-pollinate and take those. Whereas I know the seed companies are developing individual varieties which got certain characteristics. But again, I'm going back to diversity and lots of different types of gene, because when plant breeders come along and they choose the best yielding variety, that may not be the most resilient variety for drought or flooding or the weird weather that we might be having in the future. So I'm mixing everything up. So I may not get the best harvest and it will look pretty non-uniform because they're all different types. But I hope that at the end of the year, I will have some good parsnips, but maybe not all good parsnips, but I will always get a crop through this mixing up. And so I'm putting everything in one bag and just mixing it all up and letting them all do their own thing, and seeing what happens. It's a big experiment, but I've seen it happen in wheat, which is doing really well, population wheat. And I think this may be the way forward for us all to be able to continue to grow the crops we love, but to also hedge our bets for the future.
Thank you for that. That was great. We do have some Q&A from the chat, and so please feel free, everyone, to continue to ask questions, but here are some that we gathered. Chris M. asked, how do you keep your soil from getting too compact and floods without digging up your soil? I
don't dig my soil. I'm no-till. And I can walk on it because it's not been turned. I don't find it gets too compacted because I do rely on plants to loosen it up for me. So basically plant roots are going to go right down deep. They're undisturbed. And the other advantage is that when you don't turn your soil, the fungal network, the hyphae that connect all your plants in the soil are all there. And they too are helping soil life, and that will loosen up. And then over here, now I know I talk about earthworms in some parts of the States, people get very agitated because they do damage in forests, and they're all introduced species from Europe. But we have a lot of earthworms, and so if we leave the soil undisturbed, then the earthworms will burrow down and create spaces in the soil which allows the water to pass through. If you are concerned and you're not 100% convinced about no-till, then I'd use a fork and then just push the prongs of the fork into the ground to create channels through the soil that the water can drain through. A bit like being an artificial worm, you can move across the soil and just push your fork in just to loosen it. But you'll find as more organic matter goes on top over the year, then the quality of the soil will get so much better, and you won't have any problems with compaction.
That's great. Thank you, Sally. The second question is Beth O shared that their frustrations with gardening is the rabbits, the chipmunks, or deers eating the garden. And this is just an endless battle. Do you have any comments on that?
I do have rabbits, and we do get deer. The advantage of a walled garden is I can keep the deer out, but the rabbits seem to find their way in under the gates and things. There's not a huge amount other than putting up deer fencing, which isn't always feasible and can be quite expensive. And so I always sort of think, plant more than I need. And in terms of other pests, I always think that if I'm getting too many smaller pests like the insects, then I've got the balance wrong somewhere. That why should there be too many aphids, green fly? Why have I got lots of black fly, or too many caterpillars? And it may be that I haven't got the balance right with the natural predators. But for those larger beasties, and I've got squirrels, which are a bit like your chipmunks, nicking all my nuts. It is living with them to a certain extent, which is not easy when you see them nibbling your favorite plants, and to plant more than you need in the hopes there's something left. But I don't have a magic answer, I'm afraid.
And that's okay. Another one from the chat is Ira J asks, how do you get biodiverse, healthy soil growing in planters on a balcony?
It is tricky, but possible. We have a substance, and I'm sure you've got it, called biochar, which is like charcoal, which is very finely ground down. And it's amazing stuff, because when you look at it under a microscope, it looks like honeycomb. And so there's lots of tiny little holes in it. And the company that produces it over here, and you get it all over the place, but they say that it actually helps containers, because it helps when you mix it into the soil in your containers, it will hold on to the water, so reduce the amount of water you need to give, and it will hold the nutrients, and it actually acts as a little house for small soil life, bacteria and fungi and things to have a habitat. So a little bit of biochar, a handful of biochar in your containers can do wonders. And then to put the organic matter on top, so not to fill the container with the compost or the soil all the way to the top, but to allow space that you can mulch it in summer, and to slowly, build up. And you'll find that actually little things like that make all the difference.
Thank you. Karen B says that they have many trees that provide lots of shade, but can you recommend a ground cover or other crop that may work in shade?
Oh, for us over here, and I apologize, it may not be appropriate for North America, things that do grow well on the ground under light tree cover will be things like squash, pumpkins. We've got some varieties that do well under shady conditions. Some of the beans and things would prefer shade in a hot summer, particularly runner beans, and up a trellis or growing up the tree themselves. And actually soft fruits, black currants, gooseberries and the like, they are naturally they would grow under the canopy of a forest. So a lot of my soft fruits in my own orchard, I'm putting them under the fruit trees so that they get the benefit of the shade and they get sort of dappled light, because they are what we call woodland edge species, so they don't like full shade, but they'll cope quite well. But it is tricky when you're under shade to find things that will grow well. You might want to delve into the world of perennial plants, perennial vegetables rather, that can cope with that more easily than an annual plant that often requires the sun during the summer season to set its seed. So I'd probably look at some of the, I'm trying to think of some of my some of the herbaceous plants, and some of my perennial kales will do quite well in quite deep shade. And there's some, you know, if you look through the lists, you'll find quite a lot of those perennial veg will do quite well. And actually, we have a Caucasian spinach, which is a climbing spinach, and that climbs up all sorts of things in the shade. So it's over a wall and it's climbing up one of my fruit trees. So you may find something a little bit different there that might cope.
Great. We have another one by Trisha T, who wonders whether dipping ponds and rain barrels encourage mosquitoes.
They may well. We will get a few mosquitoes in summer here, but we don't have the temperatures that you probably get in the southern states. So yeah, mosquitoes is potentially an issue there. Can't do much of the dipping pond. With your rain barrels and things, you can put a top on. But again, mosquitoes are food for lots of insects, a good amphibian population, birds and the like, bats like mosquitoes. So, but there is this problem in the future as we warm up, mosquitoes might carry disease like dengue fever. So it's tricky. No real answer to that one, I'm afraid. It's trying what suits your area best, I think.
That's true. Mark L asks whether we should include any plants that are not edible.
My garden has lots of non-edible plants because they have other benefits. They may be flowers to bring your pollinators and your natural predators in. They might be providing habitats and things for other animals. So I think there is a place for them. Increasingly, it's nice to see a herbaceous bed that's got a mix of edibles and ornamentals. And if you look at the group like alliums, you can have so many ornamental plants which are also edible. So it depends on your space. If you have the luxury of being able to put more ornamentals in, then I think they have a role to play. And it's a food chain thing. They may not be edible to us, but they might be edible to other animals in the garden. So I think, yeah, there is a place.
Many people have asked about clay soil. It can behave like concrete in droughts, but it's just difficult to grow in. Are there any suggestions that you have?
Oh, yeah, I've got clay soil. And about 2 foot down, it is so clay, I could probably use it for pottery. In fact, when we dug a trench to put some new fencing in and new walls in, we have a pile of pure clay. It is, I think no dig works better with clay because you're not disturbing it and you're putting lots of organic matter on the top. So my mulches tend to be organic rather than say gravel. And there is, and I don't know, do you have bracken in the States? The fern, bracken?
Emma, do you know about bracken? I haven't heard of it. Maybe.
Iridium. It's a fern. Okay. So it's a fern. And what we've found over here, there is a company that uses bracken, which is quite an aggressive fern that can actually cause conservation problems because it's quite invasive. And actually what they've found is that bracken breaks down into an amazing clay busting material. And so they sell it dried and shredded, and they sell it as a mulch, and you put it on the top of your soil and allow it to sort of be carried into the soil over time. And they call it a clay buster, and it does help. So I'm sure there might be materials that you might find similar over there. And I'm sure you've got bracken in the States in deciduous forest. And I just can't, it's Pteridium vulgaris.
We
We
do have
do.
bracken. Yeah, the chat has said that we do.
So if there's anybody who's harvesting that, and as I say, it can be quite invasive, and a lot of farmers want to get rid of it. If you can find it and compost it, it will make amazing stuff for your clay soils. But things like that, I think with clay, it is organic, adding the organic matter, which in itself will cause the clay to break up and introduce more materials. So it's a long-term process. It doesn't happen quickly. And ideas of incorporating grit don't really work with clay. It is really working with it rather than sort of adding more organic matter.
That sounds great. Folks, we are at 4 o'clock. So if you have to leave, you will receive a recording to be able to watch the rest. And we'll also include a link and discount code to the book and a follow-up email. But we do have a couple more questions left. So if anyone that can stay, please feel free to do so. Beth wonders, how do you get such a variety in a small space without wasting seeds or plants?
I think it's because I'm lucky. I have got quite a large garden. I've got a ½ acre garden, so I have the space. But I think diversity can also come from allowing, say, weeds to grow on some of your paths. To, you know, we've got lots of small, and I'm sure you're the same, lots of small weeds, which are annual weeds, which are very easy to pull up if you don't like them. But what you can get growing onto your paths might be weed covering ground cover to many extent. It might just be weed, and that will actually add to your diversity. So in permaculture terms, the more transition zones you have from one style to another, from a path to the soil, from the tree to shade to the sun, all these transition zones is where you have the greatest diversity. So if you can allow things to cover up, to have underplanting, so under some of my beds, I can get diversity from a living mulch rather than dead mulch. So allowing a cover of white clover to grow under my squash, for example, will give me more diversity, more mini habitats, microhabitats, and also nitrogen fixing from the clover, and it covers the soil, so it's doing the role as the mulch. We call them living mulches over here, and it's low growing plants growing under others. So getting these layers is quite important. So trees, so my fruit trees have got soft fruits underneath them, so I've got 2 layers there, and on the ground I've got grass and bulbs, but I could easily have another edible. We grow something called Camassia, which is an edible bulb. So you can actually increase the amount of edibles in the area by being quite clever over your design of garden, that use the layers and make use of vertical spaces as well. Things growing up the walls, up trees, so you get more 3D habitats creating, which doesn't sound right, but it's getting more into one space. And I'm a crowded gardener. I don't stick to the rules of spacing and things. I like to cram the vegetables in and get lots of variety within one bed. And I don't crop rotate, but that's another day.
Okay, we have one more for this session. Rafaela wonders whether you expect that having a king who is dedicated to organic gardener will positively impact the organic movement in the UK.
I do hope so. I edit Organic Farming magazine for the Soil Association, and he is our patron. And we've been associated with him for many decades now as Prince of Wales. He has a very large agricultural holding, which is all organic, which is wonderful. And now as the king, I'm sure you'll have more say in what goes on. And I've just heard that in Sandringham, the estate in East Anglia, he's digging up the lawn, which is great, and he's going to plant it up with a topiary or something. But no, he's fully behind the organic movement, and he puts a lot of money into the research, and he supports what we call innovative farmers, farmers who are trialing new ideas. And he's very much into believing that conventional farmers have a lot to learn from the organic movement, and he wants to see more conventional farmers trialing some of the methodologies that the organic movement uses. And that will be exciting in years to come, the results of all that innovation in the field of organic. So I'm hopeful that we catch up with Europe, because Europe's way ahead of us in organics. Germany and France, far more organic farms than we have in the UK, unfortunately. So we've got a lot catching up to do. So yeah, very hopeful.
Well, that's great. And we want to thank you, Sally, for today.